We'll just leave that there for the moment because we'll go to a live event. The Greens Senator and gambling spokesman Richard Di Natale is holding a media conference in Melbourne. This is in relation to gambling.
The cheapest and most cost-effective way of achieving reform. It wasn't on the agenda until the Greens put it there in October last year. We felt that the focus on mandatory pre-commitment gave too much ammunition to the club's campaign. It's a policy that's hard to understand and easy to confuse and manipulate. So we put that proposal forward. We note that Andrew Wilkie and Senator Xenophon, who have been very important in this debate, have now swung behind that proposal, and we're really grateful for their public advocacy now on that issue. It's a much better proposal because, firstly, it's very cheap to implement. We've got a report today from the Australia Institute that essentially demolishes the arguments of Clubs Australia. Clubs Australia state that the cost of implementing this proposal is upwards of $3 billion. The evidence now is that in fact it's 10 times lower, in the order of $350 million and probably less than that. So we know that it's actually a cheap reform. We know that it's effective, limiting the amount of people that limiting the amount that people can bet to $1 or less per spin will reduce the harms associated with problem gambling, average losses of about $100 an hour compared to thousands. And we know that, in fact, it's the reform that has the best chance of passing the Parliament. There's growing support for it within the Parliament and the community. So we've got a situation where we've got a simple, cheap, effective proposal, as demonstrated by today's report, a proposal that we put on the agenda in October last year, and that now is firming as the best way to achieve poker machine reform in this country. The real issue now is, does the government have a genuine appetite for poker machine reform? The focus should be fairly and squarely on the Prime Minister. This has become a test of her leadership. She's walking both sides of the fence on this issue. In order to prevent reform, she cited the cost as an issue. Well, we now know that the cost is no longer a factor. She cited the fact that she needs to work with the Parliament. Well, we know, and I certainly know from my discussions with some of the independents, that this has far more support and a much bigger chance of getting through the Parliament than mandatory pre-commitment. She's also cited her agreement with Andrew Wilkie. Well, Andrew Wilkie stated explicitly yesterday that he would support $1 bet limits in preference to a mandatory pre-commitment. So we have a situation now where the government, who's been walking both sides of the fence, trying to give the appearance of being serious about reform, but in fact using all sorts of excuses to try and avoid its obligation to implement a reform. We've got a situation now where the government needs to make a call, and they will be judged very, very harshly if they walk away from this really important reform, which will save the lives of many people, which means kids will have food in their belly, which means that people will not lose their jobs, their homes, their incomes. That's what this reform's about. So I think we need to put the focus squarely on the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister now needs to decide whether she's serious about this issue, and if she is, she'll get behind the Greens' proposal for $1 bet limits, and we'll do something for the first time in this country about problem gambling. Happy to take some questions.
Andrew Wilkie has threatened to drop his support for the means-tested private healthcare rebate if Pokies reform doesn't go through. Is that something the Greens would consider as well?
Look, we think it's a bad idea to be cross-trading one issue against another issue. You judge, in this game, you judge every issue on its merits. So we won't be trading off one issue against another issue. We think poker machine reform stands on its merits. Look, we think Andrew Wilkie made a mistake by giving a concession to mandatory pre-commitment. We don't need high-intensity machines in this country. All we did with that proposal was give ammunition to Clubs Australia to run what has been a very deceptive and misleading campaign. And now we know a campaign that is essentially based on a lie that is the figures for the cost of implementing poker machine reform. I'm pleased that both he and Senator Xenophon are getting behind dollar bet limits. That is the best chance of getting reform through the Parliament. He needs to stick to his guns and make sure that he's true to his word and does everything he can to get this reform through the Parliament.
How can those two sets of figures be so far apart? Because it's a massive discrepancy.
It's a huge discrepancy, and it's an indication that what we've seen from Clubs Australia is a very deceptive, misleading and deceitful campaign. Clubs Australia, it appears, will say or do anything to protect their profits ahead of protecting the lives of young kids and families who are struggling with problem gambling. So what we've seen is we've seen all sorts of lies, all sorts of statements made which have absolutely no bearing on the truth. I mean, this statement that $1 bet limits would cost this amount of money, we've known for a long time has been wildly inaccurate. In fact, I had a meeting with Clubs Australia in my office in late last year. They presented to me the cost of what they believed the cost of $1 bet limits were, without having any knowledge whatsoever of our timeline for implementing it. Now, the cost of implementing $1 bet limits depends on the timeline. Now, if you want to know why, have a look at the report, but it's about the cost of replacing machines that depreciate over time. Their costs have been based on wildly inaccurate assumptions that they've known are inaccurate. As I said, when we met with them in our office, they were not even aware of our policy and its timeline for implementing. They also haven't responded to a letter from us asking them for justification for those figures because they know they're wrong. They know those figures are wrong. An independent economic evaluation today has proven that. And now the focus needs to be on the government, because the government has said cost is a barrier to implementing this reform based on Clubs Australia's figures. Well, we know the figures presented by Clubs Australia are wildly inaccurate, are very self-serving, and in fact the costs are 10 times lower than what they've suggested. So this really is a test of the Prime Minister's leadership. This is an important reform. She's made a commitment to Andrew Wilkie. She's made a commitment to the Australian community that she wants reform. No more excuses. We know the Parliament has an appetite for $1 bet limits. We know that Andrew Wilkie is prepared to go with $1 bet limits and alter his agreement. And we now know that the cost is no barrier. So it's fairly and squarely in the Prime Minister's court, and she'll be judged very harshly if she walks away from this reform.
Clubs Australia, regardless of what facts are correct or incorrect, they've had a very strong campaign to try and get their version of the facts across. How confident are you that you're going to be able to convince people that the new report is a more accurate assessment of what the costs will be?
Well, I mean, all you can do in this business is to present the facts as they exist, to keep working. I know there's a coalition now of groups who have got together to respond to some of the lies presented by Clubs Australia. I think that it was a mistake to make the concession with mandatory pre-commitment, and I think it's being acknowledged now with the growing support and advocacy of Andrew Wilkie and Senator Xenophon for the Greens' proposal for $1 bet limits. We need to all get behind that proposal. We need to ensure that people understand what it means. What it means is that 90% of Australians who bet on the Pokies won't notice the difference, because 90% of Australians bet $1 or less per spin anyway. This is a reform that targets problem gamblers, people who are prepared to lose thousands of dollars each hour on these machines, and we need to make sure that people understand those facts. So there's a growing a unity behind that. I think there are a number of groups who have coalesced today and will be announcing a campaign to try and counter some of the lies of Clubs Australia. But in the end, it's up to the government. I mean, we've seen over a number of issues, the mining tax, now poker machine reform, that cashed up industry groups will do everything they can to protect their profits. I mean, that's what this is about. And you elect governments to show some leadership on these issues. If the government's prepared to walk away from this, I think the Australian community will judge them very, very harshly. Ultimately, the ball's in their court. They could announce tomorrow that they will be getting behind the $1 bet limit proposal, have a good chance of getting that through the Parliament, have the full support of the Greens in the Senate, have the support of most Australians. Let's not forget, most Australians support poker machine reform. So in the end, really, it is a question for government, and I think that they need to really have a hard look at themselves, and they need to decide what they stand for. And this will be a real test of that. Thanks.
So that was the Greens gambling spokesman Richard Di Natale live from Melbourne, calling on the Prime Minister to get behind $1 maximum bet limits on poker machines. This is all coming to a head this week with Andrew Wilkie saying the government has to introduce legislation by May, otherwise he's going to withdraw his support for the minority government. Andrew Wilkie has held a few meetings with the Prime Minister this week on the subject, and an anti-pokies group called Stop the Losses Coalition is going to launch a campaign this afternoon. For more, let's cross to Julie Doyle in Canberra now.